has. During my time in the Senate, I've worked with folks across the aisle on our shared priorities, and I have no plans of changing that practice now. But make no mistake, I'll push back forcefully, respectfully, when the President and I disagree. One of the things I have learned, though, is that there is a difference between what some elected officials say and what they actually do. And rather than listen to what they say, I really prefer to watch what they do and see if those are consistent. Only hours after being sworn in and speaking of unifying the country, President Biden unilaterally canceled the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. And that same day, the administration halted all new energy leasing and permitting on public lands and waters. Well, with these unfortunate actions, President Biden is killing thousands of well-paying U.S. jobs and kicking the U.S. energy industry while it's still struggling with the pandemic. I had hoped, I still hope, to work with President Biden on an all-of-the-above energy strategy that prioritizes our fossil fuels. We have 280 million cars on the road. People are going to still need gasoline for the foreseeable future, but also renewables and innovative technologies that help us harness our most prevalent and reliable energy sources. And one of the things that I think is exciting about some of the research that's being done is on carbon capture technology, which ought to be, again, something that we can all agree on as we transition to the next forms of energy. As we begin a new Congress and welcome a new president, I'm once again reminded of the words that were quoted from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, recently deceased, Justice of the United States Supreme Court. She didn't originate it, but she did make it popular when she said, "You can disagree without being disagreeable." Of course, democracy itself expects a competition of ideas, but not necessarily the mudslinging and name-calling that have become all too common. I hope we can return to the respectful battles in the days and months ahead and know that there's no better battleground for that to happen in than the Senate, where sometimes we live up to the billing as the world's greatest deliberative body. Madam President, the primary feature that separates the Senate from the House or any other legislative body is free and full debate. That's why it takes 60 votes to cut off debate, so you can then have a vote and pass a piece of legislation with 51 votes. It forces us to do what we ought to do anyway, which is to have fulsome debate, allow minority views to be presented, and then, once the debate is concluded, then to have a vote on the underlying bill. But fundamentally, the founders saw the Senate as a place that protected minority rights. And I've been here long enough to be in the majority and in the minority, and we know what goes around comes around in the United States Senate. It's as sure as day follows night. And that's why we're called a deliberative body. In the House, you have 435 members, and in order to pass a bill, all you need is a majority. Got the votes? Jam it through. But there has to be some place, somewhere, in a nation of 330 million souls where competing ideas can be seriously debated. And that's why our founders created the United States Senate. George Washington was famously said to have told Thomas Jefferson that the Senate was meant to be a saucer to cool House legislation, like a saucer was used to cool hot tea. Well, if partisan bills are the hot tea, then the Senate cloture requirements are the saucer. Rather than a simple majority, here in the Senate, you have to get 60 out of 100 senators to support a bill in order for it to advance. I know we all would love to see each of our ideas passed into law without any delay or extended debate, but that's not the way the Senate is supposed to work. It forces us to do what we ought to want to do anyway, which is to do the hard work of bipartisan negotiation and compromise. Come up with an 80-20 solution that can leave the 20% you don't agree on for another day and another battle, but to pass into law and make progress on behalf of the American people with the 80% we can't agree on. Well, neither party has had a filibuster-proof majority since the late 70s. And as a result, senators from red states and blue states have had to work together, as they should, to reach agreements on nearly every piece of legislation that has moved through this chamber in the last 4 decades. The only real exception is the budget reconciliation process, which by the rules can be done with 51 votes. But otherwise, in the main, 60 votes, a bipartisan majority is required in order to move legislation. When bills require bipartisan support in order to pass, they're more durable. The fact is, if you pass a partisan piece of legislation, the next time the majority flips, they can undo it. Well, I think it's useful in terms of our comedy, in terms of our relationships, in terms of our ability to get things done for the American people, to try to figure out how to do things on a bipartisan basis. And while I know bipartisanship isn't necessarily popular with the political bases of either party, it's critical to our democracy. Unfortunately, some of our colleagues on the other side have expressed an interest in using their newly gained powers in the majority to blow up the filibuster and to shatter that important cooling saucer. Make no mistake, that would do irreparable harm to this institution and inflict serious damage on our democracy. Without the 60-vote cloture requirement, both chambers would be majority rule institutions with a steady flow of partisan legislation moving through Congress. If the same party controls both chambers and the White House, that party could pass strictly partisan legislation that would quickly be signed into law without a single vote from the opposing party. Does that feel good? Well, if you're on the winning side, yeah. Is it good for the country? No, it is not. It's efficient, but it's not effective. It's not lasting. It's not durable. It doesn't provide the sort of stability and ability to plan that the current structure provides. Well, all the reasons I've given for not doing away with the Senate cloture requirement is the reason no majority has ever tried to blow it up before. During the past 4 administrations, the Trump, Obama, Bush, and Clinton administration, there was a period of time when the president's party controlled both chambers of Congress. If you go further back in history, you'll find dozens of examples. But no Senate, until now, has ever been so short-sighted to get rid of the cloture requirement in the filibuster when it comes to legislation. If Democrats carried out their threat to do that today, they'd clear the path to pass a radical agenda that would fundamentally reshape our country without a single Republican vote. As a reminder, we have a 50-50 Senate, and in the House there are 221 Democrats and 211 Republicans. In all of Congress, there are 10 more Democrats than Republicans out of 535 members of Congress. That's far from a progressive or a radical mandate. As I said, elections happen, majorities change, presidents come and go, as do United States senators. In 2 years, Republicans could win the majority in either or both chambers. In 4, a Republican could win the White House as well. If we were to do away with this restraint on snap decisions and partisan legislation, what would the succeeding Republican administration likely do? It would simply undo everything that had been done on a partisan basis. Well, would our Democratic colleagues support a rule change to blow up the filibuster when Republicans control both houses and the White House? Would they believe the Senate minority should be silenced, as they believe now? As I say, what goes around comes around, and the shoe is always on the other foot eventually. The good news is we don't have to wonder what the answer would be because we already know it. In 2017, the Republican-led Senate, House, and White House, when we held both houses and the White House, there was fear by some folks across the aisle, actually both sides of the aisle, that the filibuster would be eliminated in order to clear a path for a Republican agenda. That was when 61 senators, a filibuster-proof majority, wrote a bipartisan letter to then Majority Leader McConnell and Democratic Leader Schumer, urging them to protect the filibuster. That's 61 senators. Among the co-signers were 27 current Democratic senators. One of the signatures on this bipartisan letter is that of our newly sworn-in Vice President, Kamala Harris. I can promise you that Leader McConnell has no interest in eliminating the filibuster when he was Majority Leader or now as Minority Leader, because he knew the institutional damage that this would cause and the damage to our democracy. Unfortunately, Leader Schumer refuses to acknowledge that most basic fact. The two-party leaders are now in the process of negotiating an organizing resolution on how this new reality of a 50-50 Senate will operate. Fortunately, there's a modern precedent for how this has been done, and the two leaders have shared an interest in emulating the 2001 agreement negotiated by Tom Daschle and Trent Lott. But because of the newfound obsession of some on the left with uprooting the cornerstone of the Senate, Leader McConnell has asked for assurances from Leader Schumer that the filibuster and the cloture requirement will remain intact. After all, it's not unreasonable to ask your negotiating partner to commit to not breaking the rules, which is all Senator McConnell is asking for. Senator Schumer has derided that request, calling it extraneous and saying it falls outside the bounds of the 2001 organizing resolution. But I'd like to remind our colleagues that in 2001, the majority party was not threatening to blow up the Senate rules to advance a partisan agenda. That's why it wasn't the subject explicitly of that negotiating organizing resolution. There's no need to ask for assurances on the protection of the filibuster because it wasn't even a question to be answered. Our Democratic colleagues have relied on the filibuster while Republicans have held the majority. I can think of time after time after time we've tried to pass more COVID-19 relief bills that our Democratic colleagues felt was inadequate. And time after time after time, they used the filibuster to prevent passage of that bill, which was their right. I think a mistake, a decision I disagree with, but within their rights under the Senate rules. Republicans have also relied on the filibuster while Democrats have held the majority. We all recognize that at some point the shoe is always on the other foot, which is why no one has been so foolish as to eliminate the legislative filibuster or even seriously to consider it before. I hope our colleagues on the other side will avoid making this tragic mistake in order to pursue short-sighted political goals. And in an encouraging sign on Friday, the White House indicated that President Biden does not support getting rid of the legislative filibuster either. President Biden has served in the Senate for, I believe, 36 years. He understands how this institution works, how it's supposed to work. And his advice, and it's only advice since he's the president and not a member of the Senate anymore, is don't go there. I encourage our more than 24 Democratic colleagues who've repeatedly voiced their support for maintaining the legislative filibuster to insist that this critical stabilizing force in our democracy be preserved in the organizing resolution currently being discussed by Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell. I truly believe that if we don't do that, if the legislative filibuster is eliminated, that we will all rue the day. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I yield to my colleague.
President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. I tell you, I'm going to follow right along with the comments that my colleague from Texas has made, because in Tennessee, whether someone's a Republican or a Libertarian or an Independent or a Democrat. They have very high expectations of what this Congress is going to be able to accomplish, and they also have high expectations for this administration. What they are doing is looking there and they're saying politics and politicians are not what this is all about. They don't necessarily matter. Policies matter. And as my colleague is saying, maintaining the filibuster rule in the Senate, allowing robust, respectful debate so that we arrive at a sense of compromise and we do what is best for the American people. And today I was talking with one of our Tennesseans, and they were talking about it doesn't matter what's being said on social media, on Twitter or Facebook or Parler or any of the social media platforms, that when you strip it all away, good policy is good people. And that is what matters. Good policy is good policy. It is good for the people. And that is where the emphasis should be. So when I say they have high expectations, I don't only mean that they want good policies. They want this to focus on them. They want it to focus on their concerns, their communities, their schools, their right to feel secure, their right to enjoy free speech, their right to pursue their happiness, their American dream, their right to celebrate and protect life. It's about them, not politicians, not politics. It's about the American people. From their perspective, we can spend hours debating the budget or immigration reform or data privacy, which I'll talk more about later this week, as long as at the end of the day, whatever compromise we reach not only meets their needs, but recognizes that the people are the most important part of this entire equation. The people. Every member of this body understands that when the balance of power shifts, sometimes that means that the guy across the aisle is going to get the upper hand. Things change. But it would be a mistake for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to assume that that means we're willing to set our priorities and our principles aside. It doesn't mean that we're going to submit to their agenda. It doesn't mean we are going to conform to their agenda. It means we're going to stay true to our principles, represent our states, and work diligently for what is going to be best for the people. We may have had a changing of the guard here in Washington, but it doesn't mean that any of us have set aside the promises that we have made to the people we represent. And that's why I came out so strongly against the Biden administration and the president's executive order that really crushed the jobs and the potential for energy security that came with the building of the Keystone XL pipeline. This was a project that had achieved bipartisan support. And what are we seeing now? Lost jobs, lost livelihoods, more money being taken out of the taxpayer's pocket. For similar reasons, I came out in opposition to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and reversing our course on the departure from the World Health Organization. For me, this isn't about politics, it's about the policies this new administration has decided to unilaterally say yes to without consulting Congress, without including the people in the discussion. And just so we're all aware, President Biden said yes to more unilateral policy changes on day one than any president in our nation's history. More than any president in our nation's history. The Biden administration looked at those new policies and decided that the result, achieving that outcome, was worth whatever it would cost the American people to get it. So over the next few weeks, we'll also be examining the president's cabinet picks to get a sense of the trade-off they'll be willing to make. Safety is at the forefront of everyone's mind back home in Tennessee. Not just safety from COVID, but from the bad actors and the foreign adversaries who continue to show us just how far they're willing to go to undermine us on the world stage. Back in Tennessee, we have a saying, when somebody shows you who they really are, you better believe them. And I will tell you that they are paying attention. And I will tell you that they're not very impressed right now with some of this so-called soft talk that they're hearing on proposed policies toward Iran and the communist regime in China. This is why I chose not to support the confirmation of our new Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. I also had some pretty tough questions to ask Secretary of State nominee Blinken about some of these same issues, dealing with Iran, dealing with China. And many of the proposals that I'm hearing from them have sounded strangely familiar from years gone by. We don't have to look overseas to find some very real policy differences between what Tennesseans have said they expect and what the Biden administration is signaling that they want to deliver. In his hearing before the Commerce Committee, Transportation Secretary nominee Pete Buttigieg signaled to the panel that he would put the administration's environmental goals ahead of some very basic changes to federal policy that would lighten the regulatory load on county and city mayors trying to get their transportation projects off the ground. As I told him, many times the regulations at issue don't just slow the projects down, they kill the project and that town's prospects for growth, for a better life, for people in the community. Hopefully, he's going to keep in mind what it means to these mayors the next time he's asked to consider the benefits of removing unnecessary red tape. These trade-offs many times are just too destructive to say yes to. And I would encourage all of my colleagues to look at the compromises the president is asking each and every one to make, not just in terms of what we stand to gain, but what is going to be the cost? What is the monetary cost? What is the cost of freedom? What is the opportunity cost that will be delivered to the American people in order for the administration to have their way, to get their income? That is the question we should each ask. What is the cost to the American people in order to protect them, in order to meet the expectations that they have? And we should be listening to the people. Policies are about them. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, I have one request for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Madam President, it is a pleasure tonight to be making the case for Janet Yellen, former chair of the Federal Reserve, to be the next Secretary of Treasury. It is an awfully easy case to make. Chair Janet Yellen deserves to be in the Senate Confirmation Hall of Fame. She has already been confirmed 4 times for key economic positions. Tonight, the Senate can deliver an especially important economic judgment. Confirm Janet Yellen a 5th time and know that she will work with every single one of us to get our workers, our small businesses, and all Americans from sea to shining sea back on solid economic footing. Tonight, I'm going to spend just a few minutes discussing several important matters we learned from Chair Yellen's confirmation hearing. First, Chair Yellen is an exceptional economist who has a rare gift. She can take complicated economic theories and put them into understandable language, all while showing a real heart for the millions of Americans who are hurting through no fault of their own. I asked Chair Yellen at her confirmation hearing, what will give Americans the most bang for the economic recovery buck? And Chair Yellen simply walked through the priorities, particularly going to bat for our small businesses. I come from a state where we have only a handful of big businesses. We're overwhelmingly a small business state. And in her confirmation hearing, she spoke clearly about those small business needs. And she talked about the concern she has for innovative and important approaches to expanding unemployment benefits, to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our people. And she also focused on reducing hunger and approaches that will help stretch anti-hunger dollars. Second, Chair Yellen knows that it would be a big mistake for the Congress to go small on economic relief. She's acutely aware of what happened in 2009 when the government took its foot off the economic gas pedal too soon, and recovery was compromised as a result. And she also understands that emergency economic relief, like unemployment compensation, needs to last as long as the emergency. It cannot be tied to arbitrary expiration dates where potential political agendas come before human needs. There's a reason why the Finance Committee approved her nomination unanimously on Friday morning. And I touched on some of those factors, and I'm going to amplify a little bit. For example, nobody deserves more credit than Chair Yellen for the longest economic expansion in American history. It lasted until the pandemic hit. As Federal Reserve Chair, she led an important change to the status quo in economic policy. Previously, there had been too great a focus on inflation and deficits. Chair Yellen said, let's zero in more on unemployment, income, and inequality. And she believed that the economy could run a bit hotter. The record shows that the Yellen approach was right on. Unemployment went down, wages went up, and a lot of people were better off than they were before. That's exactly the kind of thinking America needs again, because confronting the COVID economy is hammering working families in particular. Again, another clear reason why Janet Yellen's the right pick to be the next Treasury Secretary. The most recent economic data shows that 1.4 million people nationwide had filed new claims for unemployment benefits in the last full week of the previous administration. So, it's not hard to figure out what that means. It's an economic catastrophe. It's more than twice the highest figure from any single week in the Great Recession. That means 1.4 million people, so many working families, are suddenly walking on an economic tightrope. Every single day, balancing the food costs against the fuel costs against the rent bill, worried about finding a new job, getting a badly needed shift at work, falling behind on rent or the mortgage, feeding their kids, paying the electric bills, paying medical bills, worried that the recovery is headed in reverse, and worried about whether the Congress will be gridlocked. The country lost 140,000 jobs last month. My home state lost more than 25,000, in part because the Senate, in something that just defied common sense, waited around for the recovery to peter out before passing any more relief. Thousands and thousands of neighborhood restaurants and bars and mom-and-pop businesses have been shuttered. Nearly 11 million workers are out of a job. Another 4 million Americans have fallen out of the labor force entirely since this time last year. Unless the Congress acts boldly and quickly with more relief, the damage from the COVID economic crash will long outlast the pandemic itself. That must not be allowed to happen. The key, of course, is for the Senate to get down to work, and one of the best ways you can do it is to confirm someone who is eminently qualified, Chair Janet Yellen, to be Treasury Secretary. As I touched on, we're looking at working with her on a host of key economic issues. As I've said, as the new chair of the Finance Committee, my first priority will make sure that this Congress does not commit again the mistake of 2009. In 2009, the sense was, well, maybe we're getting there on economic recovery. We'll be able to come back later if maybe we didn't do enough. Well, we all know that a missed opportunity is a missed opportunity. And in 2009, the Congress said, all right, we can take our foot off the gas now. It was too early, and there wasn't any next effort to make up for the damage. I'm committed to making sure that doesn't happen again. And suffice it to say, in 2009, it took 7.5 years for the unemployment rate in Oregon to return to its pre-recession levels. This time around, the Congress has been warned. The warning I'm giving about making sure the Congress doesn't take its foot off the economic relief pedal too soon, it's not the first warning. Chair Powell, for example, made it clear that the biggest danger lies in not doing enough. Increasing relief checks to $2,000 is key. The Congress needs to increase and extend unemployment benefits for the entirety of the COVID crisis. And you do that by, in effect, tying the benefits to the real world, to economic conditions on the ground. And that's been my proposal for some time. Other colleagues have long advanced similar ideas. It is not a revolutionary proposition to say emergency relief should last as long as the emergency. Simply stated, and not be held up, not be held hostage by the arbitrary political agendas of members of Congress. If you don't do it, dysfunction and gridlock in Congress creates still more havoc for people who've done nothing wrong and just need help. A decade ago, that help went away too quickly because benefits expired arbitrarily and Congress did not keep up with extensions. The Congress needs to do better. And I believe that should include important upgrades as well to unemployment insurance, which was created in the last century. I don't think it's too much to say we at least bring a critical safety net program into the relevant century. Now, sometimes these programs look a little rusty in the modern economy. Sometimes it's because of outright sabotage. But workers suffer, particularly Black and Hispanic workers. And so there are steps that need to be taken in addition to modernizing the benefits, increasing base benefits, bringing all workers into the system, and ensuring it can hold up in a crisis. Finally, Chair Yellen had some important comments on fixing America's broken tax code. And I will tell you, Madam President, I start with the proposition that a nurse who's treating COVID patients and paying taxes with every single paycheck should not face themselves in a disadvantaged position when compared to billionaires who, in effect, do no such thing and can postpone and postpone and postpone paying their taxes. Now, there's a lot of work we need to do to repair the 2017 bill. The previous administration actually increased the incentives for corporations to ship jobs overseas. I want to fix that mistake. I want to work with Secretary Yellen on energy policy because so much of it deals with the tax code. And suffice it to say, those are just some of the challenges that Chair Yellen will face when I believe she is confirmed tonight as Treasury Secretary. Supremely qualified, a member, in my view, of the Senate Confirmation Hall of Fame, a proven economic policymaker, and finally, I say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, it is long past time to have a woman lead the U.S. Treasury Department. Chair Yellen's got my full support as colleagues come for this vote, and it's a significant economic policy vote. Make no mistake about that. I just ask colleagues to reflect on the fact that Chair Yellen was approved by the Finance Committee 26-0. Sometimes I say about this place, I have questions whether you can get a simple decision like ordering a sandwich decided on a 26-0. She was approved unanimously because she gives public service a good name. I urge my colleagues to support Janet Yellen for Secretary of Treasury when we vote in just a few minutes. Madam Chair, I yield the floor.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you. I want to visit this evening on the Senate floor and take this opportunity to recognize a public servant, a leader, our former Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Ryan D. McCarthy. Secretary McCarthy led our nation's Army from September 30, 2019 to January 20, 2021. And during that time, he made it a more modern, agile, and lethal fighting force. We have worked together on a number of projects for Kansans and those who serve or have served on our nation during his tenure as Secretary, Acting Secretary, and Undersecretary of the Army, and I've grown to consider him a good, solid friend. One of my most memorable experiences in the Senate is visiting the 1st Infantry Division, soldiers in Germany and Poland, soldiers that come from Fort Riley, Kansas, with the Secretary, followed by our trip to Afghanistan to meet with troops on the front lines in the global war on terror. Those visits marked the beginning of our friendship, and since then I've appreciated his guidance and his support during his visits to Kansas and our many discussions here in the nation's capital. In 2019, Secretary McCarthy joined me in Kansas to visit Sites Elementary School, which serves families of the Big Red 1 soldiers and on Fort Riley. Secretary McCarthy was instrumental in helping to find funding for this school in 2011 when he was the Special Assistant to Defense Secretary Robert Gates, a Kansan. I was pleased he joined me in Kansas to visit the school and its students that he helped create in 2019. We also met with Fort Riley leadership and then traveled to Wichita to visit defense manufacturing and academic leaders to discuss the future of Army procurement. These personal touch points with soldiers and with the Army community were some of the reasons why Secretary McCarthy was universally respected within the Army family. While I will always appreciate our personal engagements with soldiers, I will also remember our efforts to support soldiers and veterans when they step off the battlefield or separate from military service. This past Veterans Day, we co-authored an editorial that discussed our parallel efforts to support the mental health and well-being of soldiers and veterans. Reports show Americans across the country are feeling isolated and alone in today's socially distanced environment, including our nation's servicemen and women and veteran populations. Between my efforts as chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee to implement the Commander John Scott Hannon Veterans Mental Health Improvement Act and Secretary McCarthy's effort to build interpersonal connections between soldiers, we are working to give soldiers and veterans the tools they need to overcome mental health challenges they face. As Secretary McCarthy transitions out of the watchful eye of public life, I rise this evening to express my appreciation for his leadership, his character, and his moral compass. He never let politics or convenience influence his decisions, and that has significantly benefited soldiers, Army civilians, and veterans in Kansas and across the nation. As the chairman and now ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, I will always strive to help veterans find success after service. Secretary McCarthy, I have no doubt that you will find success and happiness after your dedicated service to our country. I wish you and your family, and I thank your family for their support of your public service, but I know that you and your family will find a quality life with purpose and meaning as you enter the next phase. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Louisiana.
I ask unanimous consent to complete my remarks before the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to recognize and thank 3 long-serving aides who have served my office, but more importantly, served our nation proudly, and they are now moving on to the next chapters of their life. First, Chris Gillott. Chris Gillott was my legislative director and for 8 years has been my right-hand person on policy. He never failed to take the ideas we discussed together and craft the actual policy needed to make a meaningful difference in the lives of folks in Louisiana and the lives of all Americans. He was a master at navigating the partisan divide to find areas of consensus upon which we could build to advance real solutions. And as always struck, he's on the first-name basis with the legislative director of and fill in the Democratic senator or the Republican senator's name. You had a sense that in the era before Zoom calls, they would go out and have a beer on a regular basis. And that helped us tremendously. We saw this fully on display recently, as Chris was a central figure in the so-called 908 coalition, which jump-started stalled COVID relief packages. And it wasn't just the relationships between the senators, but again, as I spoke, between the different legislative directors from both parties, all offices. His efforts will also have been central to passing legislation to ban surprise medical billing, a more than 2-year effort that will have a direct and positive impact on the pocketbooks of American families. He was crucial in our effort to make health care more affordable, pass generational tax reform. For every major legislative pursuit, I could rely upon Chris. But many in Louisiana may not know that he's also been a central figure engaged in some of the most pressing issues affecting our state, including offshore energy production, revenue sharing, energy regulation, permitting, the National Flood Insurance Program, and public works related to flood protection, all important to the well-being of our state, the folks who live there, as well as our entire country, and all these were regularly under assault. Chris was a fearless advocate for energy production and for the jobs that energy production creates to not only help meet America's energy needs, but to meet the individual families' financial needs. He has been on the front lines to prevent changes to revenue sharing that would gut the money used in my state for hurricane protection, flood mitigation, and coastal environmental renewal. He has defended the National Flood Insurance Program to ensure that this critical lifeline remains accessible to people across the country and important to those in Louisiana. Thank you, Chris, for all that you've done for me and for those of Louisiana. The next person I will speak of is Allison Kapsner-Solly. Allison is a Minnesotan. She said she grew up on the upper end of the Mississippi, but she found a home in the lower end of the Mississippi, or at least the office that represented Louisiana. She joined my staff at the beginning of my first Senate term as a scheduler, but through sheer excellence became Deputy Chief of Staff and a close confidant. Trust is so important. I learned I could always trust Allie's judgment and her ability to accomplish anything. She is irreplaceable. She's had an impact on this office, ensuring that we better serve Louisiana, but that impact has meant that we will better serve Louisiana even after her departure. Well, examples. For any office to succeed, it needs to run efficiently and effectively. I knew this, that we had to have systems. Allie figured out the systems. She implemented them across all the offices here in D.C. and Louisiana. She kept things running smoothly. And she has a skill of identifying an individual's strength and helping that individual leverage those strengths into results that contributed to the whole, but also to the future of the individual. I'm about to say this about Allie, but I could say it of Chris and also of David, whom I'm about to speak of. Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45, Jesus speaks about servant leadership. In there is the quote, "The greatest among you shall be your servants." Allie is someone who served others and helped others serve as well. Whether it be our staff, our mission, our constituents, the state of Louisiana, or the United States of America, she served creatively and tirelessly. She will be greatly missed, but I am looking forward to all that she achieves as she enters the next phase of her career. Now let me speak of David Mills, a Louisiana native, a man of tremendous character and deep faith who served for 5 years on my staff. He came to Washington because he felt called to give back to his state and nation through public office, through public service. He was working in Congress for the right reasons, and his work reflected that. David handled pro-life issues and other legal issues for my office. He was key in last year's impeachment trial as an attorney, providing quick, reliable research to supplement my understanding of the testimony that we heard. David also has the ability just to note something others don't notice, and then very gently suggest some modification of how I would handle a situation, And that modification, although nuanced, could be so important. And I really learned to trust those insights. David also handled privacy issues, and he's laid the foundation for work that will continue after he has left us. As society becomes more technologically centered, we must ensure that data privacy laws keep up. David was on the forefront of that, thinking, how do we protect the privacy of consumers? As I mentioned, this will be an important issue in this upcoming Congress. And just let me be specific. David developed legislation on questions regarding the data that is collected from a wearable, a smartwatch, a contact tracing app, and other information that provides personal health information, but which is not covered by current personal health information laws. Our office will continue to build on David's work in those areas, and I thank David for all that he has done. Sometimes, Madam President, people say, oh my gosh, those folks who are younger than those of us in the Senate, is there something lacking? I can promise you among these there is nothing lacking. They are the leaders that will take your place and my place as we pass the baton to the next generation. In turn, they shall pass to another to leave our future brighter than it has been in the past. And with that, Madam President, I yield.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Question is on the nomination. The yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Orono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Cantwell, Cardin, Cassidy, Crapo, Duckworth, Feinstein, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Leahy, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Schatz, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Hawley. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mis- Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock. Aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey. Aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no.
It's not that, it's just I want you to know what we're gonna say, so he has the right.
Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no.
Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 84, the nays are 15, and the confirmation is confirmed. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President.
Senior Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Junior Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I want to be one of the first senators to congratulate Dr. Yellen, now Secretary Yellen, to be Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. You saw as a strong vote, and there's no doubt that she has the credentials, the experience, the qualifications to be Secretary of the Treasury. Former Chairman of the Fed. I mean, her resume is off the charts, and I know her nomination is historic for so many women across the country, including my 3 daughters. So, Madam President, I'm mentioning this because I certainly intended to vote for now Secretary Yellen, and I was a no vote. And I want to explain my no vote, because I had a very good conversation with her. Just the other day, we covered a whole bunch of topics. Everything from Alaska Native corporations to the strength of the dollar to our debt and deficit, big macroeconomic issues that are important to the country, particularly as we're in a recession, important to my state. But we got to the topic of energy. And reluctantly, I am saying this now because I was a bit shocked, that despite a long, robust discussion, it was very difficult to get her, from my perspective, to commit to being a Secretary of the Treasury, the most important economic player in any cabinet, in any government, in the U.S. government, besides, of course, the President, to commit to being a strong advocate for a robust, all-of-the-above energy sector for the U.S. economy. Now, Madam President, this is not a radical proposition. I would argue that every Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton has been a robust supporter of resource development in our energy sector. Again, all of it, renewables, oil, gas. And the reason is because it's been such an important driver of economic growth and jobs for pretty much our entire nation's existence. And now that we're in this recession, deep recession, and we need job growth, good job growth, and we need a strong recovery, to me, having the Secretary of the Treasury be a strong proponent in the debates about policy for the energy sector, I thought was a no-brainer. As a matter of fact, I think pretty much every Secretary of the Treasury has been that person. And again, the 2008-2009 recession, the deep Great Recession, the #1 driver of economic growth and job growth and capital formation for the U.S. economy was the energy sector. And it was supported. Democrats and Republicans for decades have supported a strong energy sector. But despite a long, respectful debate with now Secretary Yellen, who I certainly want to have a good relationship with, could not get that commitment, which I thought was surprising. As a matter of fact, I thought it was shocking. And it's the reason I reluctantly voted no, because again, she is very qualified. Madam President, what's going on here is we're starting to see policies that I believe need a national debate. A national debate. We're starting to see policies. Yes, we all want renewables, clean energy, but we have a really important, strong energy sector. Prior to the pandemic, we were the world's superpower of energy again. One of the reasons we won World War II is because of our energy sector. And the men and women who've been producing energy, all of the above energy, are great patriotic workers who've been doing it for decades to the benefit of every single American. But we need a debate, because what I'm starting to see with the new administration, unfortunately, and I've had discussions, and hopefully they're not going to go down this path, is executive actions that are going to target certain sectors of the energy sector of the U.S. economy, the workers, in no debate. We should have that debate. It's an important debate. It's really important to my state, but I think it's really important to America. Every Secretary of the Treasury for the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades since World War II has always sought the goal of getting America back to energy independence. That's good for jobs. It's good for low-cost manufacturing. The heating and energy bills of American families. It's good for our national security. It's good for our foreign policy. And we are pretty much on the verge of doing this. And now we're going to start to unilaterally disarm? We've gotten to the point where I can't find anyone, and I hope I'm wrong, in the Biden administration cabinet who's going to be a proponent of a strong energy sector. Who is it?